Hello, everyone. So let's talk about this upcoming Mercury retrograde cycle. It's a very interesting one. And I feel that if we can unravel the energetics, we can find some useful medicine and support for this time. Let's introduce the general archetype of this particular Mercury retro in Scorpio. Whenever we deal with Mercury, we're always dealing with a linearity that in essence doesn't exist, meaning nothing in life is, calling itself a name, and nothing is ordering itself in a particular construct. Life isn't intellectually organizing itself so it makes sense to us, but we are. So we create logical constructs that allows us to interact with the things of life, interrelate our ideas to one another, be able to share information, gather more information. And thus, more broadly, Uranus, Mercury will speak to our general idea of, where are we going? Not in like an ultimate, cosmological sense, like what's this all about? Where are we going kind of deal? But more, it's like if you're looking at a map, there's a logical order. Every mile is one exit on the freeway, and you know that there are 20 miles until this exit, and you make a right and you'll go here. There's an order to it. And in our life, there's a certain degree to which there is order. And what's interesting about the Mercury archetype, it's, Mercury is the ruler of Gemini. Gemini is an inconjunct to Capricorn. And it's always meaningful to think about these relationships. The relationship between Gemini and Capricorn basically says you have these logical constructs in your mind, and you're using them, you're organizing them so that there is some sort of solid structure that we can all agree upon and follow. But the challenge here is the structures that we create with our Mercury Gemini mind, they're just very specific constructs that we've chosen to put together in our minds. So it's workable, so we can function, so we can do things. So we're all in agreement to what we're talking about and where we're going. But the schism that happens often with Mercury retrograde, and it really, to me, kind of brings out the tension of that inconjunct, is the actual flow of things, the way life is organizing itself, what things are for, and on the road that you're journeying, you might see exit signs that are marked at 1 mile intervals, but that's just a one way of thinking about it. There are also lots of trees, and those trees are communicating with one another, and they have a system, and there's a logic and there's an order to that. You can logically think of anything according to any reference point, any way of looking at life will give you a different way of giving logical. And that's why children are so cool, right? It's like they don't actually have any fixed Capricornian, they haven't learned the ways of the world. So if they ask you a question, you can really tell them anything and they wouldn't think it unbelievable. Why is this happening? Well, it's because, Santa Claus or whatever, or the tooth fairy. And it makes sense. So there's an idea in their mind of when you lose a tooth, a certain thing happens. This is actually no better or worse than all the things that we expect and believe in. And so in general, the Mercury retrograde wants us to step away from the conditioning, step away from the fixed routes of thought. And that can create confusion and thus insecurity relative to the need to know where we're going and what's happening and what everything is for, so that we can expect life to conform to our constructs that we've already established, that we've agreed to share with one another. All right, I just hooked up my mic, so hopefully the sound is better now. So this particular Mercury retrograde is interesting because it actually involves Uranus in a very potent way. It's also wedged in between, in a shadow period where basically it's going to go retrograde back to 25 degrees Libra. So like this whole cycle sort of wedged in between this Capricornian Libra square. squaring Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn. And then during this whole retrograde, it's basically in opposition to Uranus. So there's a lot of interesting themes here. Let's tune in and unpack it. So I'm going to share my screen. So first, this is from September 23rd. This is basically when Mercury first entered its shadow. And just to clarify, if you don't understand this, shadow is the degree, the sign, the degree, everything that it'll go back to at the very end of its retrograde journey. So when Mercury, completes its cycle in several weeks from now, in a few weeks from now, about a month, it'll go back to 25 degrees Libra. And so just noting that it's, starts off the cycle squaring Saturn. So the theme really here is constructive communication. Mercury and Libra squaring all this. Capricorn, Saturn was sort of just stationing direct at that time. It was at the very end of its retrograde cycle. So it really brings up a lot of conversation. What are we doing? Where are we going? What are we? What are our plans? And it's not just, in terms of you and someone else. It also can speak to how you are in relationship to the outer world. What are the relationships and the agreements and the exchanges and the understandings that are necessary for you to function and then be able to relate to one another and move through life? It's really inviting a lot of conscious, clear, non-reactive, thoughtful communication. Non-reactive, Mars was also opposite Mercury. So this is a potent one. And we've progressed since then. And now look what's happening. Next Wednesday, on October 7th, we have Uranus and Mercury opposite each other. So Uranus is going retrograde at this time. And when Mercury reaches 9 degrees, which is just 2 degrees from its retrograde station point. So meaning Mercury begins moving very slowly at this point. From this date, it'll take a whole week for Mercury to move 2 degrees until it goes retrograde. So it's moving right now as we speak, tightening into this opposition with Uranus. And we'll speak about that, but let me just give you a little more context. October 13th, Mercury stations retrograde. And there was a chart that I didn't actually think to look at. So let me just take a look at that as well. And this is basically the day where Mercury in its retrograde opposes Uranus again. And it's pretty soon after it goes retrograde, October 19th, just, yes, that's 5 days, 6 days after it goes retrograde, Mercury will oppose Uranus back at 9 degrees. November 3rd is the day where it goes back into its shadow and it ends its retrograde at stationing direct. And November 19th is actually where Mercury returns to the degree where it first went retrograde. So let's speak about this dynamic here, because what's actually unfolding, where we're going right now, is towards this opposition. It's interesting to have a relationship between Mercury and Uranus, especially during a tight retrograde period. Mercury is the lower octave of Uranus. So let's really speak about those two and then bring them into opposition. Mercury is the linear mind. It's our local memory. Now, local memory isn't accurate. As I was describing, it's how we're choosing to intellectually organize something. We're picking things apart and giving it perspective, giving it context, giving it meaning. So if you have a memory of something, an experience, an event, you're going to recall that memory, and everything that you recall is going to be a specific classification of the mind oriented towards specific experiences that you're absorbing, that you're focusing on, right? Your memory of that experience isn't necessarily going to be, someone said, I love the color of your eyes, and you felt, bubbly in your heart. You're sitting in a room, they said that, and what is your memory? You're going to remember what was relevant to you, the details that are specific to however you're choosing to organize your life experience. And that will include as well your story of the person that said that, the story of yourself, the story of how you felt, right? You're not going to recall the what was happening through the window, even though that might have been in your peripheral vision. You might not recall what the room smelled like. You're also going to have a lot of subjectivity. You may not actually recall literally what the words were that were spoken. You might have a general sense of it. It's a local memory, and it's specific things that you're recalling. In our memories, just like if you write a dream down, the mind is searching to grab information, right? And you might write the dream down, and a few hours later, you remember another detail. And then the mind wants to make sense of that. It's like, okay, you know, in a dream, your father said something to you, and that you want to make it literal. But then we get into the Uranian realm, and it's not literal. It's all actually just an archetype. It's all impersonal. And the dream symbols of our dreams and of our life are just these impersonal expressions that are manifesting themselves. But our local memory will pick apart certain aspects, certain pieces of it, and recall that. You know, two people can have the same experience. This is a great way to explain it. And they're going to recall it completely different ways. Factually, they both might be right in the sense that they're recalling things that are actually there, but it's filtered through their own subjective experience, and there is a filtering of what to include and what not to include. But when we get into the Uranian realm, it's totally impersonal and completely objective, and it's not about what does this mean to me according to my existing mental context. It's not about fitting into a syntax that I've established in my mind for how things work and how things make sense. So the Uranian memory is actually true memory. I call it 360 degree vision, smell, sight, sensory perception, psychic perception. It's what is before you give it a name. Thus, in not giving it a name, you're not necessarily classifying it, and thus in your memory, it's not being stored as an event. Once we classify something as a thing and you can think about it, you have a clear idea of an event. And that's what we do with Mercury. But with Uranus, we actually can't easily recall events because we're not classifying it. It's just happening. That's again why in a dream, we can have all kinds of experiences. Things that are happening that seem completely non sequitur, number sequences, all these archetypes, elements that maybe make no sense to our linear mind, even perspectives. You know, if you have a dream about a spider, it might not have anything to do with your own experience of spider. These are oftentimes universal symbols, archetypes, completely impersonal in their nature. And so Uranian memory is basically what's held in the individuated unconscious, and we have this memory of this lifetime and all of our past lives, everything within the soul field of experience, but we don't consciously recall it. But we might have a sense of feeling some kind of resonance with it. You know, if you go into the bathroom and there's a book on the shelf in the bathroom, and whenever you pee, you're looking at that book, but you don't really realize you're looking at the book. It's just sort of imprinted in your mind. And then, you know, a few weeks later, or at some other moment in your life when you're not in that home, not in that bathroom, or maybe a few years later after, you know, living in that home with that bathroom, you go to a restaurant and you see some writing on the wall, and that writing is the same script. It's the same font that you saw in that book, and suddenly you're having memories and feelings about, you know, a conversation you had in that home where that bathroom was with your ex-partner, and you start feeling trauma. That's Uranus, and you can't locate why necessarily. We're not consciously recalling, oh yeah. I mean, you actually have to relax the mind and go back, right? Step far back. This can often be more of a hypnotic state. I'm sure there are more scientific words for it than a hypnotic state, where we actually have to drop out of our linear constructs and let it reveal itself from a deeper place within our own field, within our own soul memory. That this font reminds you of the book that you've never read. You just like gazed upon it casually when you pee for whatever long. So these things imprint us, and trauma can be imprinted in those ways. And so we live our life. And Jeffrey Wolf Green once said something that I find to be quite interesting, and I agree. 80% or so of our fears and traumas and reactions, our strong reactions, are completely irrelevant to what's happening in the moment. And that makes sense to me. This is not an exact quote, but the general idea, and it makes immense sense to me. The things that upset us, that trigger us, it's actually rooted in a deeper, suppressed realm within our own consciousness. And we're aware of it. And so we personalize things and we don't actually understand the things that are actually occurring and what are actually going on. So we can easily be traumatized. We can walk through life experiencing our interactions, our day-to-day life. And everything can bring up for us the trauma that we haven't quite healed from the past. The feeling of unsafety, of fear, paranoia, of disrest. And the work with Uranus in general and really unraveling that is cultivating the observer mind. It's basically removing our story from the object. And actually, when you remove a story from the object ceases to be objectified, right? It ceases to be a thing, really. When we remove story from our experiences, from our people, from the events and happenings in our life, then there's a free mind that does not depend on past thinking in order to determine what is right now. And that's a liberated state. That's a liberated mind, actually, that does not have a reference point for interpreting this moment. So when you bring these two together, the challenge here, and this is with Mercury and Scorpio, is there can be suspicion. There can be a deep sense of if you take this interpersonally, Scorpio is intimacy, right? I can't trust you. Reading very deeply into the minds of people outside of you, trying to probe into other people's psychology. I don't feel secure, so I'm gonna, investigate and go deeply into understanding what's really going on here, like what's happening underneath the surface. Can be communication and exchanges where deeper psychological dynamics of distrust and jadedness. Can I really communicate? Can I really share? Scorpio needs trust. And the challenge within Scorpio is if we're sourcing our security entirely outside of ourselves, then we're always going to say, oh, I can't trust. I can't open up. I can't share because we feel so abandoned and hurt and betrayed. This can also be a general suspicion and jadedness towards life. A deep mental broodiness, an unwillingness to look at one's own thinking, one's own mind. And Mercury and Scorpio is really inviting us to probe, to understand what is the source of my pain, of my fear right now. It's in my own thinking, and to actually, penetrate. I always like to think of Mercury and Scorpio with that Ramana Maharshi quote, that inquiry is a way of kind of like taking a stick to get at a splinter, really using the mind to focus into the mind, to get through the mind, to uncover the suffering in our own thinking. So meditation, chanting, focusing deep on the bottom line and actually withdrawing our energy from the external world. And Mercury wants to make plans. Mercury wants context. It wants organization. It wants to feel secure in being able to map everything out. And so this is really bring us to a more soulful understanding and self-knowledge, not external. And this retrograde theme will, of course, really bring that out. In its opposition to Uranus, This asks us to find stability in observer. And even if our perceptions emerge as intense and scary, as threatening to a core sense of security, if we react mentally, if we get into the monkey mind and act from a fearful place, which is a controlling place, we will take everything personally. We will take everything as an unconscious trigger to deep, unprocessed wounds and fears that are for us to heal at this time. Finding a point of quiet and stillness in the observer mind allows us to kind of be exposed to deeper layers of psychological content that needs to come up. If it's about feeling threatened or insecure or jaded or distrustful, or wanting to know where to go or what to do about all of this, how to move into the next decision in life. Uranus here in opposition asks us to cultivate the mindset that holds appreciation for an actual unraveling of the mind, right? It's like, even though things might feel really personal or entangled, and Mercury can get lost in a lot of thoughts and issues, and it, when we're in the midst of Mercury retrograde in Scorpio, it can literally feel like being in the muck. And in the muck, it's like there are a whole bunch of objects like dishes, paper and pencil, computers, clothing. It's like trying to reach through the muck and trying to like clean all the things out. The energetic of it can actually feel very overwhelming, and that it's really entangled and confusing. And thus, it can actually breed a strong sense of either victimization, resentment, overwhelm. If we're trying to control and we're staying in that fear, if we're thinking that we have to go through the external muck, it can really breed a lot of pain. And so then to hold this awareness of this is actually the working out of the mind in the realization that the external world is held on the inside. Something me and my partner have been playing with is this teaching from the Course in Miracles, which is we've written the script, right? We've basically established the world that we want to see through our mistaken thinking. And you look at the life you're living, the experiences you're having, the emotions that we're having, our perceptions of the world in the moment, to really take full responsibility, Scorpio, for everything that we're creating is to say, I have chosen this. Nothing outside, no one is the cause of anything. This is all a reflection of my own mind. And thus to understand that the outer world, from a Uranian perspective, is actually always and perfectly reflecting back to us our inner world, our mind. Uranus corresponds to thought projection. And so when we hold this holograph of trauma in our minds, it's simultaneous to what's happening on the outside. So the first step is always having that awareness of, oh, I'm suffering. I've created a world of suffering. This must be in my mind. These thoughts of distrust, pain, opposition, confusion, this is in my mind. And so being able to have that simultaneous awareness of, as if you're waking up from a dream, and then you write down in your dream journal all of the symbols in your dream, and then you do a Jungian analysis and you say, okay, everything in that dream is you. This Uranus in Taurus says, become stable. Learn how to find a still point of quiet and observer in the midst of all of the content unfolding and arising. Because what this wants to do, what actually wants to happen, is it wants to take us deeper into our own empowerment, to actually become empowered and clear within our thoughts, to separate the things and the events and the peoples of our life from our thoughts about them. Thus we can see what is. When we can see what is without putting on it our subconscious need for pain and suffering, we can actually allow the truth to reveal itself. And what's the truth here? Well, Uranus is always going to say harmony, togetherness, inclusion. But it's not going to happen through our conditioned ideas and constructs of what that is, right? The challenge often with Uranus is we want to, hold hands and live in this utopian concept, this idea, this way of living that fits an idea of community, of togetherness. But Uranus says togetherness is innate. It's sort of built into the nature of life. And so you are created as you are created to be, and I am created as I am created to be. And we resonate perfectly as we are, in perfect harmony with the cosmos. We don't have to try to make it happen. We don't have to try to figure it out. It actually is a self-emerging process. So all of the challenges and the confusions that really also speak to where are we going? How do we read this map? Well, first, to recognize we're not reading it accurately. We're reading it often in fear and trauma and misperception. And then secondly, it actually, during this time, there's an amazing possibility if we will practice, really work with our minds. There's a beautiful opportunity to see through, gain some deep psychological insight about our own selves, and then see how the outer world's unraveling as a reflection of the inner. And as it unravels, we get to actually have that clear vision for what things actually are, the natural harmony and unfolding of beauty and togetherness and inclusion and sharing that life is designed to be. All right, so, we have it stationing retrograde on October 13th. And then again, 6 days later, it opposes Uranus. So this is a very tight opposition with Uranus pretty much for the entire month of October. It's going to be within a few degrees of Uranus, more or less, for the entire month of October. I think maybe towards the end of October, it goes more than a few degrees. But definitely for the first few weeks or so. So this is a very potent thing. And we can understand that when Uranus moves direct much later on, here we have November 19th, Uranus has returned to where it was. That means a few days before or so, 3-4 days or whatever, probably a few days before, Uranus will have opposed, Mercury will have opposed Uranus for the final time. So we're in a window right now for the next month and a half. And it's useful. Hopefully it can actually be really helpful for us to have this context, to have this perspective, to see where Mercury is right now, where it's going for Uranus, how it's stationing retrograde, and just to say, okay, this is a process unfolding. In general, I find things that work really well with, both Uranus and Mercury correspond to the nervous system in their own way. So they can both be hyper vigilant and very mental. And if traumatized, then like the local linear Mercury mind can get very concerned with like details and information and thoughts and whatever. And the Uranian level is just like the state of fear. Mercury's trying to give it context. So it can be very hard to get out of the mind and the obsessive mind. So it's actually really important during this time to give ourselves a lot of self-care. Epsom salt baths, meditation, quiet stillness, to consciously say during this time where there's actually a lot of healing potential, we want to cultivate more stability and ease and peace, and to actually let that be a practice that our life is oriented towards, that our life is actually meant to be about peace, stability, togetherness, wellness. And just trust it. When Mercury goes back to its shadow point on November 3rd, which will be interesting, when it goes direct again, it'll square all that Capricorn stuff, and there's probably a lot to say about that because that will coincide with, you know, the US elections, and holy moly. So there's a lot of conversation, exploration, figuring things out right now, and trust the journey, trust the path. And yeah, so wishing us psychological, mental empowerment, stability in our mind, and peace.